So, start off with your name.
Okay, my name is Audrey Johnson. It's Audrey Maxfield, really, and then I added the Johnson when I got married 60 years ago. So, if I'd done it again, I would continue to be Audrey Maxfield, but I didn't. So I'm known as Audrey Johnson.
What's your position in Pittsburgh?
I happen to be the town and village historian, and I love it, and I'm just so proud to be that, and I've had a great many years doing it, and hope I can continue for a little while longer anyway. I've got so many things I have to do or want to do, so I don't want to give it up yet.
Like, what kinds of things?
Well, there's always questions from the public, emails and telephone calls and so forth about, I found my ancestors in the census and I think they're buried in Pittsburgh. Can you tell me all about the family? Well, they'd love to have a whole 3 or 4 pages worth, but they don't usually get that because I can't possibly know everything there is to know about every family who lived in this community. But I know a lot about them, and I have experts who can help me with it. I call them up and say, do you know such and such family and where they lived and something about their house and etc. And then I also am doing interviews, and I also give talks, and I give tours, and so those are the kind of things that I do.
How long have you been the town historian?
Well, a very long time. It's kind of like I didn't used to ever let anybody know how old I was, and I didn't used to let anybody know how long I've been doing this, but I have been the historian since 1979, so that's a long time. And I still don't have everything done.
Is there a co-historian, or is it just you?
It's just me. But I have a lot of people I can talk to.
So, can you speak a little bit about Pittsburgh during World War II?
Pittsburgh during World War II. We were living in a house at the down on the other side of the bridge on State Street in 1941 when the war happened. It was a Sunday afternoon, and we were listening to the radio, and I was making Christmas cards on the dining room table, and my parents were sitting in what we called the music room, and they were listening to the radio, and all of a sudden the announcement came over that Japanese airships had bombed Pearl Harbor. And I never had seen my mother and father so upset as they were that day, so it really made a big impression on me when the war began. It didn't affect us here right away, but I do remember the next day, that was Sunday, and the next day we went to school, and our principal had us all gather, the whole school gathered. Now this is in the Lincoln Avenue building that's still there, and the whole school was gathered either in the gymnasium or in the hallways or whatever, and we were all listening to President Roosevelt make an announcement to the world that America and the United States was involved in a war with Japan. And I can still see it in my mind, and it was so quieting. Nobody knew what to do. It was just such a shock to us all. We didn't know what to expect. We didn't know whether airplanes would be coming over and bombing our community, and just didn't know what was going to happen. Life soon settled down, but there were a great many young men who scrambled to sign up and join the services. Many that my oldest sister knew, and so it affected us in that way. The other thing that I remember a lot about was food rationing, and if no one's been through it, they don't understand how very difficult it was for housewives to try and feed their families with the kind of things that we could get, foodstuffs that we could get. And one of my favorite memories is we had margarine, and the margarine came in a package about like this so, and it was a plastic package, and the margarine came white just like Crisco, and there was a little capsule in there that you had to break that had yellow coloring, and you manipulated this bag around and around and around to make it look yellow so it looked more like butter. Easier to eat that way than it was when it was white like Crisco. And as I say, life continued on pretty much, but we did know a lot of the young men from church and from other organizations and from my sisters who joined the services in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, what all. And my oldest sister was very much involved with a young man who joined the Marines, and their plan was to be engaged. She was a senior in high school, and he entered the Marines, was sent to the Pacific, and he was killed in the war in Okinawa, and that of course brought it pretty close to our home, and it was a difficult time, very hard for her, and those things affected our family. Not any more than that. We didn't have any boys in our family, so none of us had to go. Had cousins who did go. None of them, fortunately, were killed. But it's hard for kids who haven't lived through something like the Second World War to understand. And then it just seems as though we've had one war right after another. And we think we're a peaceful country, but it doesn't feel that way sometimes. So those are my kind of World War II memories. It was hard. Another thing was that shoes were hard to get. Sugar was hard to get. Clothes in general were not easy to get. My dad, I remember, tried very hard to keep the soles on our shoes from going through, and we were walking on the pavement, but he was able to somehow or other fasten soles that would go on the shoes so that it felt sometimes as though they were that thick because they'd been piled on each other. I don't know what he made them from, but the other thing that I remember a lot about the war was that it was winding down, and we had VE Day, Victory in Egypt, or Victory in Europe Day, and that was pretty exciting, and hoping that the war would then end with Japan and in the Pacific. And I remember watching the terrible dropping of we didn't watch the dropping, but we saw the replays of the atomic bomb and how it devastated that country. And even though they were your enemies, you had to worry and think about them. I happened to be with a friend. I was visiting her for the weekend, and she lived in Phelps, New York. And we had gone on a Sunday afternoon into Geneva to the movies. Her father had taken us in. And in Geneva, there was Samson, which was a Navy base pretty close to Geneva. And we were in the movies, and we were watching, I think, For Whom the Bell Tolls. I think that was what we were watching. And all of a sudden, we heard this noise outside with fire sirens and bells ringing and horns blowing, and thought, what in the world? And we went out, and it was when the Japanese had surrendered, and so it was VJ Day that had started. Her father and mother came to pick us up in Geneva. They came from Phelps into Geneva. And they picked us up in the car, and Geneva was a mob scene with all of the sailors from the Sampson Naval Base getting there, and the traffic was tremendous, and the horns were blowing. And I remember her father rolled down the window, and somebody somehow or other threw in a can of beer, and it went all down the front of me because I was sitting in the front seat. So I got baptized with beer that day. And I can remember all those things, but we went back home again sometime or other, and I know I went to bed, but they probably celebrated all night long. I don't know. So those are pretty much my memories of World War II and being involved that way by a stay-at-home child. And but they did make some pretty indelible memories.
How old were you?
Well, let's see. The war started in 41, and I was 9, and the war ended in 45. So I was that much older. However that was, 41 to 45, that's 4 years, and I was 9, and that made me 13. Yep. So think about where you were when you were 13. What kind of memories can you...
Nothing like that.
No, nothing like that, and let's hope it doesn't happen again. I know that you remember 9/11 very well, I'm sure, and think about where you were when you heard that the planes had flown into the Twin Towers. I think that's an indelible memory that will never be forgotten from the people who were alive at that time.
Well, I was two or three.
2 or 3?
I remember the aftermath, but I don't remember the actual event.
Right.
When you were in school that day when you heard the president's speech, what went through your mind? Were you just shocked and confused? Or?
Yeah, it seems to me what went through my mind was wondering, will we have planes flying overhead, and will they be dropping bombs on us? And not knowing, because we'd never lived through a war before, so not knowing what to expect. And wondering if my father would be affected, whether he'd have to go and join the army or some sort of service. And just thinking about the unknown. We just didn't know what was going to happen. And that's kind of what went through my mind. And listening to President Roosevelt, who sounded so very sad. And that was when you heard probably the speech about that it's a day that will live in infamy. And I'm not sure if I knew what infamy was at that time, but I do remember him saying that. And it was funny where we were all, my class happened to be standing in the hallway going up to the gymnasium. And I can remember standing on those steps there. And I don't know if you know Lincoln Avenue School at all, but the gymnasium looks pretty much the way it did when I was there in school years and years ago. And it was so quiet. Not a soul was making a sound except for coughing and sneezing and so forth. But I don't think I heard anybody crying. I don't think that, but it was just so silent. And to think that the whole school was gathered around and together, and we were just very, very much affected by that whole thing. So those are my childhood memories.
Do you remember anything after you heard about like the war started in school? Like how was your school life affected, or did you just kind of
I don't think it was very much. We just kept on doing. I think that then things were organized about trying to write to servicemen and see if we could help the Red Cross. our mothers, especially the mothers, were going to Red Cross meetings and knitting, and I don't know whether those socks ever got to the servicemen or not, but they knitted a whole lot of them. And then they talked about rolling bandages. I never did go to one of those meetings. They were mostly for adult women. And pretty much everything just kind of happened. It wasn't as though it was a great big bang all of a sudden. Oh, did I spoil it?
No,
Okay.
you're good.
It wasn't a great big bang that all of a sudden you couldn't get sugar, but can't make jam this year because there's no sugar, and you can't use very much on your cereal because there isn't very much, and the milk, oh dear, somehow or other we couldn't get whole milk or regular milk, so we had to drink evaporated milk. Have you ever done that? That's awful stuff. And it was not but we lived through all that, just kind of accepted it. If your mother said, I'm sorry, that's all the butter you can have, you can't have any more, then you just said no. You grumbled, but you didn't get it, so we lived with it. And we were awfully glad when the whole thing stopped and we could kind of get back to normal. That was another thing, all the servicemen coming home after the war was over, and people that you hadn't seen for a long, long time, and they came back. It was probably very difficult for them to find jobs, but there were jobs finally for the young men coming back from the war. I didn't have to experience that either. I think I was pretty well sheltered from, as a teenager. I didn't get very much involved. Oh, another thing that we did, and older teenagers did this too, we helped the farmers to go and pick up potatoes. That is absolutely the worst job in the whole world. Oh, it was awful. It's almost always a rainy, cold day, and you go out there in jeans or whatever, in the dirt and the mud. It's an awful job, and we picked up all those potatoes because there weren't men or boys around to do those jobs, so the girls, and we got out of school to do that too, but I said once was enough, I'll never do it again. It was a terrible job. And people helped pick apples and peaches and grapes and things like that. And and then there were many victory gardens. We planted a lot of vegetables and things, calling them victory gardens because we were trying to grow our own food, which we hadn't done before. The supermarket was always there, and so we didn't have the gardens that produced the vegetables that we could have had, and we did have after we started gardening. And I think that kind of went out of fashion after the war was over and we could get our vegetables and things. So a lot of things that probably I'll think of after we've talked, and I'll think, oh, I should have said that, but...
Well, we can have another interview.
Oh, we can.
Yeah. I've decided to extend my project a little bit more until I'll probably stop filming in mid-November. So if you do think of anything, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email, and we can sit down and have another little chat.
Okay. Okay.
Let's see. Trying to look to see if there's anything else I wanted to talk about.
The other thing was gasoline and cars. Of course, there weren't cars made after 1942 until after the war was over. And tires were very hard to get. And so I remember my father having to patch. I don't know how he did it, but you'd have to patch the tires because they could wear out. And gasoline for the automobiles, there was a stamp that was about that big, and it went in the window of the cars. And for a passenger car, it was a letter A. And if you had a gas stamp A, you didn't get very much gas, so you didn't go on joyrides or go out and look at the pretty fall leaves. You just didn't do that anymore. You used the car only for where you had to go. And my father was just very, very careful about that. So we were kind of stuck home for 4 years and didn't take any trips or anything. That was another one of the things that was difficult for the people living at home, but certainly we were at home and not being deprived of all of the food the way the other European nations were. So if I think of other things, I'll give you a call.
Got a couple more questions. If that's okay. It's about 3:10 right now. So, after, how did you feel impacted by the war when it ended? Do you think it affected the way that you live your life? Or?
Well, that's a pretty profound question. Let's see. Only that I felt as though during the Second World War, the whole country was together. We supported those servicemen, and we supported everyone who was working to try and make this war come to an end. And we were pretty sure we were going to win, but at the very beginning it was kind of iffy. And it was different from the wars that have happened later. Vietnam, the country was not behind the military at all. And here are people laying down their lives and we at home not supporting them. I think that is pretty awful. And so the songs and the stories and so forth that were coming out during the Second World War were good and uplifting and supportive, and people really, really felt that the men, because there weren't very many women in the services, that the men were really fighting and losing their lives to make the world safe for democracy, and that was what they kept saying. And I think we should be very, very, very indebted to anyone who goes out and does that sort of thing. So that's probably how that war impacted me. I just feel that it was very unpatriotic not to support our military in any situation.
Did you know anyone in the military then besides your sister's fiance?
Yeah, I really did. I knew a lot of people who were in the service. And another young man from our church was killed. He was such a nice young man. And my oldest sister used to play the piano, and somehow or other we always had a gang of kids, teenagers, around on a Sunday night, and we would sing around the piano like crazy. I think I knew every military song that ever came out, and they would gather. There'd be some servicemen, there'd be some young boys younger than that, and girls, and we just had a ball singing and playing the piano and acting like kids, not out on the streets, not drinking beer, just having a good time. And the house was always there for anybody that we knew who was in the service who wanted to come in.
Would your most vivid memory of the war be when you found out that when you were standing on those stairs listening to the speech?
Yeah, hearing the war start, learning that we had been bombed by Japan, and then listening to President Roosevelt the next day. Those are the two things that really stand out in my memory when I think about those days. And then VJ Day too, having a bath and beer all down the front of me. It was funny. Very startling.
I'm curious, Do you remember whether people were surprised by the bombing of Pearl Harbor?
I think so. I think most everyone was surprised in our little community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think that people were expecting that to happen. I had a cousin who was in the Air Force, and he was not in Hawaii, but he was in the service already,
Mm-hmm.
and they weren't expecting it, so I think most everyone was surprised. We shouldn't have been, I guess, but we were, and we certainly shouldn't have had all of those ships in one place, but we did. I wasn't there to make sure that they weren't.
What about when FDR died? Do you remember?
Yes, I do, and I thought it was just such a sad thing that he should die before the end of the war, because it was winding down. It looked as though we were going to win, and I just thought it was just too bad, because he had let us through. It'll come out. I'm a big Roosevelt fan, so anyway, I think that he had done everything he could to make sure that we won that war, and I don't know how much he was involved in the making of the A-bomb, but I'm sure he was a lot. And maybe it was a good thing that he didn't have to be the one who said, yes, we're going to drop that bomb. I don't know, but I admire President Truman too for doing that, and from the things I've read, and I may be biased, but from the things I've read, I think we had no choice but to drop that bomb. And so I thought, well, the other thing was with President Roosevelt, he had been the president all of my life, and I knew no other president, so it was pretty amazing, like, oh my gosh, there goes our father, and what are we going to do now, and will anybody be able to pick up the pieces that he knew what he was doing. So I didn't have a great deal of faith in Truman when he first took over, but I certainly became a fan of his too. So that's how I felt about that.